If you look around the world, you'll see that news is a very important part of lives of ordinary people in almost every society. It's true that news is a central part of political and cultural life in the USA, it's true in China, it's true here in Russia. I think, however, there is growing evidence that the position of news is slipping in society. Today I'm going to start by talking about the situation with newspapers, which is only one form of news, but I'm going to try and generalize from that to say that overall there are problems for news and its place in our society, and that these problems have big implications. The newspaper is a good place to start because the symptoms of the crisis are very evident there. There are, in fact, two dimensions to this crisis. One, a relatively simple dimension, is economic. If one looks at the USA, one sees that over the last decade or so, roughly 30% of journalists have lost their jobs, retired and not been replaced or whatever. The number of journalists is declining, the wages of journalists are falling and so on. There's a good and simple reason for this, which is that US newspapers are experiencing financial difficulties. The financial difficulties are primarily to do with the collapse of the newspaper advertising market. In the year 2000, the US newspaper, on average, got about 85% of its revenue from advertising. Over the last 15 years, that revenue has vanished, well, not vanished completely, but fallen by about half. It's fallen because advertising has moved to a more efficient place. It's moved essentially online. It's more efficient for an advertiser to place their money and their advertisement with Google or another online service than in the New York Times or the Washington Post or wherever else. And newspapers in the US have experienced a significant financial restriction, which is why the number of journalists have fallen, which is why the situation of newspapers is increasingly problematic. Not minor, but simple problem to understand. A much more general and difficult problem to understand is that since the mid-1980s, the absolute number of people in the US reading newspapers has steadily declined without interruption. And this decline is particularly acute amongst young people. People under the age of 34 in the USA are increasingly unlikely to read newspapers. Now, this is the United States of America, which is a big and important country, but it's not the only country in the world. However, I could point to similar crises, similar problems in Western Europe and, surprisingly enough, in China. What has been conventional wisdom for the last 10 years or so is that while newspapers are declining in their traditional markets in the West, they are growing in places like India and China. This is still true for India. It's still true for many developing countries. But it's no longer true for China. As China has become more developed, as the internet has been spread more widely in China, so we get the beginnings of a similar problem to the USA. So the question which confronts us is, why do young people no longer want to read newspapers? I think that one answer that people give is that they now get their news online. And this is of course true. Young people go online much more regularly, increasingly from mobile apps and so on. However, this is a different form of news consumption than that provided by the traditional newspaper, or for that matter, by the traditional television program. If you look at the most followed figures on Twitter, only one of them, Barack Obama, is the kind of figure who is traditionally associated with the front page of the New York Times, or the front page of the Guardian for that matter. The normal kind of figure, the other 9, are people like Justin Bieber, Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift, popular entertainers essentially. However, what is happening online is not that people are looking at Taylor Swift or whoever and at other traditional news subjects, but instead of. And you can see that again clearly if you look at the top 10 Google searches for the year 2015. Of the top 10 Google searches, 2 fit the model of classical news stories, both essentially the same thing, Charlie Hebdo and Paris. These are both references to the terrorist attack in Paris, and those are clearly part of the traditional news agenda of any medium. However, the other 8 are again popular entertainers. In the case of Google searches, mostly the stars of a television series called The Kardashians, which I'm told is as popular in Moscow as it is in New York or London. So what we have is evidence that yes, young people go online, yes, young people find news online, but the kind of news that they look for, the kind of news that they're consuming, tends to be different from the kind of news you would find in the New York Times, the kind of news you would find in The Guardian, or the kind of news that you would find in most Russian newspapers for that matter. What this suggests to me is that there is a general problem with news. It's not simply an economic problem of the newspaper. If you look at television news, it's true that there are 24-hour news channels, but these have very, very small audiences. In Britain, the most successful channel, BBC 24, it's a news channel, has 1% audience share. CNN in Britain has an audience share so small it cannot be measured. It's less than 0.1% of the audience. I would guess that that's true here in Russia as well, that CNN has an audience, but it's a very small audience. The fact that it's such a small audience doesn't mean that it's unimportant. That audience is going to be businessmen, politicians, diplomats, civil servants, and so on. They're important people, but there aren't very many of them. People like you and me are not, in general, watching 24-hour news. The evidence seems to suggest that overall there is a crisis of news. This immediately raises the question as to why there should be such a crisis. And in order to answer that question, we have to try and establish why, in the first place, people in 1990 or 1980 were able and willing to read large quantities of newspapers, watch television programs with news content, and so on. There is no well-established answer to this. Clearly, a number of factors contribute to news consumption. First is that news consumption tends to be disproportionately an urban phenomenon, so that as countries like China and India today, Russia 50 years ago, Britain 150 years ago, went from being largely rural peasant societies to being urban societies. So news became, and newspapers and later television and radio news became a part of people's everyday lives. Clearly, literacy, in the case of newspapers, is a major factor. Illiterates cannot, by definition, read newspapers. So the spread of literacy, which in Britain, I think, dates from 120, 130 years ago. In Russia, I would guess dates from the 1920s or 1930s, but I don't know. In China, dates really from the establishment of the new China in 1949 and so on. The establishment of literacy is clearly a contributory factor. Reasonable disposable income is clearly also a contributory factor. The very poor need food and clothing and shelter and before they need newspapers. So I think these are factors which explain why in general there should be a newspaper readership, but they don't explain why there is at present such an acute crisis. And I think I would want to relate that to the changing nature of contemporary society. The newspaper, if you like, and news in general are arguably characteristic of modern society. And as we pass from modern to postmodern societies, so the place of news shifts. I think one of the characteristics of modern society, and this is true in a whole range of different political forms, it's true in the case of the American dream, it's true in the case of European social democracy, it's actually true also in the rhetoric, at least, of Stalinist Russia, the rhetoric of Mao's China, is that we're all in it together. That whatever the difficulties we face, whatever the inequalities we encounter, in one way or another, working together, things will get better. America will get better, Russia will get better, China will get better, or whatever. I think that inclusive rhetoric is increasingly hollow for people. that if you look at, let's say, the current American presidential election, if you look at the current referendum in Britain over membership of the European community and so on, you'll see that many people no longer believe that inclusive rhetoric. There's a suspicion of elites, there's a sense that one doesn't belong in one's own country, there's a sense in which one's views and beliefs are ignored. Very often this finds a very reactionary expression in, for example, Donald Trump, anti-immigrant feeling, in racism in Britain and so on. I'm not saying this is a good thing, but I'm saying it's a common phenomenon. And in that phenomenon, in that kind of society where people think that they no longer have a place in society, their views no longer matter in society, so knowing about society becomes less important. So participating in politics, knowing about political life, reading the news is no longer an essential part of being a citizen. Today, being interested in the news is, for most people, something of an eccentricity. Much more sensible to be interested in Taylor Swift. Much more sensible to be interested in football or ice hockey or whatever diversion that one is interested in, because these make much more sense to people in terms of their everyday lives. Politics is remote, politics is distant, politics is for the professional politician. Economics is for bankers, economics is for industrialists, economics and politics are not for me, they're not for us, they're not for ordinary people. And if they're not for us, they're not for people like us, why should we read about them? Much better, much more interesting to read about scandals, sensations, sport, sex, or whatever. So I think that's what's the origin of the crisis of news, that society no longer is organised in such a way as to make the traditional diet of news, which for educated people like me and for many other educated people should be about how the society is run, about what the choices facing society are, about what the threats and dangers facing society are. That is no longer an everyday a matter of real concern. It's out with our concerns, out with our interests, out with our power to do anything about. And so I think that the appetite for news is dying, and with it, the news organisations are slowly but surely dying, except at the elite level, except at the level of the New York Times, except at the level of the Financial Times, except at the level of the subsidised news organisations like Russia Today. At that level, there is clearly an audience. Bankers still want to know what's happening to finance. Politicians still want to know what's happening to politics. Elite individuals want to know about the world they run and control. Their media survives. Our media, the kind of media which made us feel part of a world that we thought we had a stake in, are slowly dying. And they're dying because it's becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people that we don't have a stake in society. What we think doesn't matter, that we no longer control, or if we ever did, the way in which society is the direction in which society is moving.